You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Rick Skinner, Senior Consultant.
Until the latter third of the 20th century, the representation of college and university presidents from the traditional professions, engineering, architecture, medicine, law, and the clergy, was confined primarily to the latter three, clergy because of the church affiliation of some institutions. In addition, most medical schools had physicians at their head. Business, management, and commerce did not figure prominently, as they were somewhat slow to acquire full academic credibility and professional status until mid-century, and then much more so after 1960. For one thing, most of the early business schools were in European countries, not the United States, and were standalone organizations devoted exclusively to business education. As late as the mid-1970s, appointment of a business dean to a university presidency was noteworthy within academic circles. The professionalization of teacher education in what were known as normal schools and the parallel development of master's and doctoral programs in education led in time to presidents with MEd and EdD degrees becoming much more prominent and numerous, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, as more community colleges and state colleges, universities, were established to serve surging enrollments of both school-age and college-level students, the latter seeking to become K-12 teachers. As a firm, we undertake studies and analyses relevant to the talent needed by research-intensive universities, medical schools, and the other health professions, as well as major regional and national research laboratories. Often these studies are refashioned and appear in peer-reviewed journals and higher education news sources, such as the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Education. Of special interest is the leadership of American research universities, and more specifically, the backgrounds of those institutions' presidents, chancellors, and provosts, and the pathways by which those leaders made their way to their post. And some of our analyses depict some change over time, leading up to today, when we have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Donde Plowman, Chancellor of the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. She is a somewhat rare species, Chancellor of a large research university whose academic background and preparation is as a professor and dean of business. I suspect Dr. Plowman was helped as a candidate for the top job at the University of Tennessee by virtue of her time at the University of Tennessee as a very successful professor and department chair of management. So successful was she attracted the interest of the University of Nebraska, who recruited her as dean of the College of Business, from which she was selected to serve as executive vice chancellor and chief academic officer from 2017 to 2019, after which she was appointed chancellor at the University of Tennessee. Donde Plowman earned a BA degree in English from SMU, a Master's of Education in Higher Education Administration, and her PhD in Strategic Management from the University of Texas, Austin. She refers to herself as a PK, or preacher's kid. If time permits, we will explore the importance she attaches to her origins as a PK. At Harris, we know Dr. Plowman from a search we did for the chair of the Department of Supply Chain Management at another large research-intensive university. Dr. Plowman led the development of UT's program in supply chain while a department chair, not all that long ago. According to peers, the UT Supply Chain Management program ranks among the best in the country. We know that because we tried as best we could, and we could not dislodge any of the faculty in that program. They simply would not leave the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. First of all, welcome Dr. Plowman to Innovators. It's our pleasure to have you. Thank you very much. And in the last couple of years, we've undertaken a number of studies. We looked at the backgrounds, experiences, and degrees of people who were selected as presidents, provosts, deans, a whole bunch of things. We know with some sadness that women still make up less than 1/3 of all the presidents and chancellors, especially of research-intensive universities. Right. We also know that the traditional professions, law, medicine, architecture, and so forth, have long held sway as the ones producing the most presidents. Of late, in particular, we've watched as engineering and medicine have increased their numbers. We don't see much in the way of law anymore. I don't know what that says to us. Architecture, I thought every president liked to cut ribbons and things. So, and religion, and I won't touch that with a preacher's minister daughter. I won't make any comment. But a lot of those have just disappeared.
Right.
But and what's interesting to us is despite the rapid and sustained growth in the numbers of undergraduate business majors, the extraordinary importance of MBAs during all but the last 4 or 5 years, and the renown that are associated with people like Wharton and Kellogg and all that, persons whose terminal degrees are in business in the past have seldom become provost. You are the exception that confirms the rule. So let me share with you a little bit of analysis we did and sort of put some flesh behind this. We took a look, in one study, we took a look at presidents of AAU universities, really the gold standard of research institutions. Now that's only about 60 or 62, or it's not a big sample, of course, but it represents, in a sense, the universe. And what came out of that between a comparison between presidents and chancellors in 1992 and 2017, and then we looked at provost in 2017 when you were a provost, in terms of the professional fields or academic disciplines in which they earned their doctorates. Presidents from the traditional professions, law and those things, and business, education, engineering, law, those, made up more than a third of all AAU presidents in the early 1990s. Now, they make up about half. I've heard lots of explanations for that, but I'm really curious. You are the exception that proves the rule. How do you account for the rise in the professional field, and in particular, engineering?
When I observe what it is that, and I thought about this for a long time, what a president or a chancellor does. In many ways, the job looks more like what a dean does than and in particular, a dean of a professional school, I think often are very involved in fundraising and external relations, perhaps more though than some of the other kinds of colleges, especially arts, sciences, perhaps. So I think it's not unusual to see engineering deans come up to the provost level. The provost job often, however, is a very internally focused job.
Increasingly so, we find.
Yeah, and so when you get to the chancellor or presidential level, I think it's really important that you've had both of those sets of experiences, because both of them make up this job. I don't think it's accurate. Now, I'm 1 year into the job, 14 months into the job, but I cannot imagine this as being just external. That is huge. But the internal, with what's going on with budgets and fiscal, capital management, capital planning, it's both. And so I do think that, this is just a hunch of mine, because professional schools, typically business, law, engineering, have a long history, medicine, in fundraising as well as the other part, it seems like a training ground for chancellors and presidents world.
Well, you probably are aware then that for all of higher education, only about 22 to 25% of provosts are now saying they even want to be a president or a chancellor.
I know. Well, that's another factor. These are hard jobs. The provost job is a very difficult job. And I think you see people just looking around going, there's just too many external pressures, the internal pressures. Somebody said it to me recently. They said, Donde, all of the stakeholders, unlike maybe in business, and I don't know if this is true, but all of your stakeholders have strong opinions and they hold you close. So you hear from so many of them every day. And I don't know if her analogy is exactly right, that in other areas you got one or two stakeholder groups. And how close are you really, if you're the CEO of a company, how close are you to the customer? I'm guessing the really good ones are fairly close.
Exactly.
But here, I think in these jobs, you're close to the students, the faculty, the alums, the legislature, if you're a public school, every single one of them knows you, wants to know you, wants to help you do your job, and has a stake in your success, to be honest with you. You know, a stake in what you do.
I'm curious about to something you noted there. If you take most of the professional fields, there are also places where you have a whole series of external standards by which you're judged.
Well, that's a good point. So you're talking about accreditation, licensure, and
but
that kind of thing.
But including also the ratings. And ratings, 20 years ago, the ratings were nowhere near as important in student and family choices in institutions. So the other thing is that you see those ratings, and even if you were steadfast in your opposition to how they're calculated, you still pay attention to them no matter what.
Sure. That's true. I always said, people pay attention to the rankings when you get ranked highly. And when you don't, you talk about the methodology, which none of which are great. But yeah.
That suggests some skepticism on your part. No, I won't say that. I won't say that. All right.
Yeah.
Let me go to, I guess, another part of this. I suspect that most of the people who accept an appointment to serve as a president or a chancellor did not envision making existential choices. And yet, right now, you are in the process of making choices that will potentially have the effect on a large number of people's lives. I'm trying to imagine, I did 2 presidencies, but nothing like what you're going through now has ever presented itself. There were tragedies, there were terrible accidents, there were crimes in some cases. What prepared you for this particular moment and this time when, as we indicated in an earlier conversation, this is a very tense time period. And now on top of that, we have some of our most important institutions with leaders who are going to have to make, again, existential choices. What prepared you for this?
I hope I'm prepared.
I suspect you are.
I came to this position with some recent experience and successes with leading change and leading what at the time seemed monumental change. I wouldn't call it existential, but let's just say in my own experience, becoming dean of a college of business that was underperforming and under-recognized and yearning to be more and better, but not sure how to do it. And so figuring out that if we were going to make those moves, which I think we did do, and they're still doing with my successor, it required some pretty big changes. But those kind of changes aren't what you're talking about here. But I think it's kind of like you get your start with making some tough decisions like, okay, if we're going to, I was at Nebraska when we went into the Big Ten, and that's a daunting group of public universities and public business schools. So having to say, okay, if we're going to be try to become competitive in this group, we've got to honestly look at how we're doing, how is our research, how does it stack up, and what strategies are we going to put in place to move forward. And at the time, those seemed like really big decisions. Saying, for example, we did things like saying we're going to have to hire a new type of faculty, and they're going to be judged at a standard that's different than existing faculty.
Always a source of friction.
And getting buy-in on that, which we did, the place was transformational over a few years. At the time, those seemed like big decisions. Losing sleep over, is a faculty committee going to agree with the promotion of this person? But that's not anywhere compared to what you're talking about now, which is how are we going to maintain our viability with a shrinking demographic? That was before COVID. How are we now going to become, as public universities, how do we lower tuition and make college more accessible? And how do we prepare people for careers and jobs that don't really exist now? How are we going to think about that? Rather than, I think those are the existential questions in a lot of ways. Who are we, university, and what is our role? We've always kind of been this, and I don't mean we Tennessee, I mean we academia. And we're being challenged right now. I think the opportunity for us, if I can put on my, hey, I'm going to make lemonade today out of these lemons. If I can put on that hat, COVID offers us the opportunities to rethink ourselves. It already has forced us, without saying that's what we're doing, but we've had to rethink a lot of things, like how do we deliver high quality instruction virtually? We weren't doing a lot of that here. How do we make what we do accessible to the larger world? And I think the pressure from on budgets in states, Tennessee's been fortunate. Our legislature has continued to be generous in its funding. It hasn't been as critical here, but COVID's putting pressures on all of us.
Yes.
We're spending money to provide testing and residential spaces, not nearly as full as we wanted to. It's putting a lot of pressure. So I'm hoping that my preparation was in having already had the experience in making hard decisions. Not all of them went great, but learning from them. I hope that has provided me what I need to be able to make these tough decisions. I also think one thing I bring to this I'm not just a business professor. My whole background was in management, organizational behavior, reading, writing, researching about change and leadership. So I hope that I bring to this, I think I do, an appreciation for leadership. I think you got to be intentional to be good. I don't think you just show up and because I'm smart and have a lot of good credentials, that makes me a good leader. I think it requires thinking and reading and learning and working at the job of how do I inspire people? How am I going to keep people being hopeful right now? People don't feel hopeful. I mean, this is hard. It's unsustainable what we're doing. No one's had a day off in months. And there's no sight. You don't really look at anything going, well, this will be over here. I hope this place feels that experience from me as well, is that it's something in a lot of ways, every job I've had in my life has prepared me for this. Every single one of them.
I have to ask a question, and if it's impertinent, please say so.
That's right.
In these 14 months, have you turned to colleagues, peers to talk to?
Absolutely. I was on the phone with 2 today.
I think that's one of the hardest things for people in jobs such as yours, to understand just how crucial it is when somebody from another institution calls you up and says, Donde, this is what we're doing. Can you give me an idea if this makes any sense?
And be willing to share. Okay, so now I'm going to say something that's probably politically incorrect, but I think women
Thank you.
have a willingness to reach out and ask for help sometimes more than men do. And I have always done that my whole career in everything that I was doing. Not like I'm asking for help, but in a way I am asking for help. How are you handling this? I was on the phone with 2 different universities today. They weren't chancellors, but they were vice chancellors of people that I've known. I've had the fortune in the SEC athletic conference. So one of the things that's happened is we meet every week, sometimes twice a week. I've gotten to know some of them. We do some amount of sharing in there. Not a lot, because it's really focused on what we're doing about athletics. But I think getting to know people, and every time I've picked up the phone and called someone and said, could you just help me think this through? How are you handling an outbreak in Greek housing? What are you doing about it? People want it. People will share. So that's something I do.
So the loneliness, as they used to call it, you found a way. And I do think, just from conversations, and this is one of the ones I've heard it most clearly, this willingness on the part, probably more also for women than men, to seek out advice. I think it's probably going to be the thing to help some people get through all this tough times.
And it's using the connections you've built in your life up to this point, and just calling on those same people. And they call on me. And when we share information, I just think about this even in my own life personally. Anytime I've ever had a personal crisis in my life, and I've had it, I always feel better when I finally get the guts to say, you know what, I'm just going to call someone and say, I'm feeling horrible. I need to talk to someone. I say that to my children. And I think it's the same way with, we've built relationships when you're at the point in your career that I am. I've got a lifetime of people that I'm still in touch with.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, right now, we're all just so busy managing the day-to-day of this. There's not enough time. We're not going to conferences. We're not seeing people like we used to do like that. So this is incredibly isolating. And so for me, at least getting out, being willing to get on the phone now and again with other chancellors, other vice chancellors, it's helpful. If nothing else, to share misery.
Well, misery does love company, if I remember.
Of this situation.
This situation in particular. Let me go back for a minute, because you mentioned it, and it is something that we also looked up and we were struck by. Choosing football conferences to sort of sort out the world is probably not necessarily the most intelligent thing, but we actually got very interested because we were doing some work involving an institution out west. And we said, well, let's find a way to look at what those institutions, and so we we then looked around at the athletic conferences because, number one, and just being very blunt, there's a lot of money involved and a lot of risk, and especially now.
Yes.
We looked at the Southeastern Conference, which is one of the largest. It comes the closest to being a secular religion of anything I know.
Football. Yeah.
Yeah, football, exactly. And what we found out was that more than any other of the major university conference, business deans have wound up as presidents, much more so than you see anywhere else. I don't have an explanation for that.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what has it meant to you to have colleagues as chancellors and as presidents who also have a professional background and a professional knowledge and a perspective? Has that been of help?
I'll be honest with you, I haven't really thought about it. I thought about what their backgrounds are. And maybe I'm still new to this, but we've been so focused on COVID and how we're going to go forward and just what each of our campuses are doing. So honestly, I haven't really thought about that. I can tell you this, that when I was another conference, the Big Ten conference is very, very, very collegial, and the provosts there are a very powerful group. They make up what's called the Big Ten Academic Alliance.
Yes.
I never thought about I eventually learned what other people's disciplines were, other provosts. It seems like the role started defining us as opposed to so much the background that we brought to it. So I haven't given that a lot of thought.
No, we were both told when we were getting PhDs, they said after 4 years, nobody's going to care about what your degree is in. I had to call my mother and say, Mom, nobody's going to care about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask a question that
Okay.
I think I have a pretty good feel for the answer, but I am curious because we have some young people in presidencies now like yourself. The first 14 months of your tenure there at UT, I know a lot of it has been taken up since March with this, but I'm curious were there any other surprises? You've been at very large, complex institutions previously. In many cases, you've been at institutions where they have boards that are generally acknowledged to be more activist boards than in some cases. What were the other surprises other than COVID?
I think one surprise here at Tennessee was that they had some high visibility turnover at higher level. The chancellor had stepped down under bad circumstances.
Right.
That's very visible. AD the same way, but football coach. So there was kind of a feeling on the campus among faculty and staff. I would describe it as sort of feeling wounded in a way, and a hesitancy to trust someone again. Like, is this just going to be someone else who comes in here? This is a sense I had. No one said it like this. Someone's going to come in here and it's not going to work out. And so it was almost felt like a personal loss of trust that faculty and even students had about, quote, administration. So it wasn't just, it felt different to me than any other administrative job I had taken. Because there was just this sense of hurt and woundedness is the word I described. So there was a lot of time I spent in the early days, and I'm still doing it, but trying to build trust of faculty and students and getting to know them. And I think that I made a lot of progress along that ways, but then also having to do it externally. For different reasons, the external community kind of felt the same way. They want to feel good about Tennessee, and it doesn't feel good when the leadership is changing.
Yes.
And so I think we have a president in place that the state is so confident in, and he's popular, and people feel like, okay, we've got a president, and here at Knoxville, we've now got a chancellor. She's not going anywhere. And so I guess I was surprised at how much energy I was going to have to put into helping people feel like things have stabilized.
I'm curious, let me just ask it the way I'm thinking about it. In a sense, this has been a homecoming for you. You were instrumental in a program that to this day, everyone is astonished by. That's the supply chain management program you had developed.
Well, I want to correct you on that because I was in the management department. I was not at the time it was called logistics. And so the College of Business, I was on the leadership team, but I led the management department, and there was a different department head that built the logistics. So I didn't have anything to do with that. I would love to take credit for it.
Well,
because they're one of our top programs in the.
It is.
It's a phenomenal program, and they were ahead of their time in a lot of ways.
Exactly, and I must tell you, you don't have to worry about losing them. They won't go. We've tried to recruit them. So,
yeah.
Final point though on the homecoming part of this, you've come back to an institution after
9 years.
Yeah, fair play. Again, anything surprise you coming back?
Well, the first thing that surprised me was just the sheer physical beauty of this place, transformation in 9 years.
Yes.
And the other thing was how much the university's aspirations had just changed and risen. And there was just an eagerness here to kind of like, let's get going. Let's get going again.
Right.
And I think that my long-term predecessor, Jimmy Cheek, had gotten them started on that path of thinking about how we can be, what's the next step for us in the journey. And I was just pleasantly surprised at people's continued interest in raising our aspirations and then trying to achieve them and raising them again. And that's a welcome thing when the chancellor isn't the one having to say, come on now, let's raise our aspirations. The depth of the love that alumni have for this place, I didn't know that when I was here before. As a department head, you kind of got one, you're in a narrow world. It's unbelievable. And it is such a resource that I'm drawing on constantly. And those are people I also pick up the phone and call. You're a CEO, what would you do? And I've done that since I've been here.
Let me say this. We were going to ask you about your insistence on referring to yourself as a preacher's daughter, but then we all thought about the people we knew who were daughters of ministers and decided that really was not something we needed to talk about. Dr. Plowman, can we come back?
Absolutely, anytime.
Thank you very much, and the very best of luck to all of you there.
Thank you, and I look forward to seeing what you do with all this, what you're gathering.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.